All right, welcome back to the deep dive. This time,
Yeah.
we're diving into something a little different, a little unconventional even. You guys ask us to investigate the art of breaking down a door. Now, is this for that action hero fantasy that I think we all secretly harbor? Is it prepping for some kind of crazy emergency situation, whatever the reason? We got a whole stack of sources here. We got WikiHows, we got survival guides, we even got a YouTube video demonstrating like a surprisingly simple door handle trick. So you're going to use all these sources to figure out what works, what doesn't, and most importantly, how to do it safely. But before we get into like the nuts and bolts, like the actual how-tos, I got to ask you, is this even something we should be learning about? I mean, isn't this kind of bordering on, illegal territory?
Well, that's actually the first thing that pretty much all of our sources emphasize. This should be a last resort, reserved for, genuine emergencies, like a house fire. Someone needs urgent medical attention. There's absolutely no other way in. It's not about, ditching the locksmith because you lost your keys.
Right. That makes sense. So let's say we are in that really dire situation. Not all doors are created equal, though.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what kinds of doors are we even talking about here?
Exactly. Our sources make a couple of key distinctions. You got interior versus exterior doors. Interior doors are typically lighter, often hollow core. One source I saw even compared them to like corrugated cardboard covered in vinyl. Not exactly the imposing barriers we see in the movies, right?
Corrugated cardboard. Wow. That's not what I pictured at all. So, I mean, with one of those, is a good kick really all it takes to break through one of those?
Well, it might be tempting to think so. But even with those interior doors, you need to sort of assess the situation first. Our sources all agree on that. For example, which way does the door swing? Kicking a door that opens towards you is a recipe for failure and probably, a bruised ego.
Yeah. Good point. So check the hinges first. Always check the hinges. Now, speaking of technique, one source specifically advised against jump kicks. Honestly, that was my go-to move in my head. What's wrong with a good jump kick?
Well, jump kicks might look cool in action films, but there's a reason they're not really practical. You're sacrificing stability and power for that cinematic flair. You're much better off staying grounded, using your full body weight, targeting the weak point.
So it's about technique, not just brute force.
Interesting. And what about the classic shoulder ram? Is that another Hollywood myth? Or does that actually work?
It might surprise you, but kicking is generally considered more effective and less likely to injure you. Your foot can actually generate more force than your shoulder, and you can target those weak points a lot more accurately.
So much for my action hero moves. You're really making me rethink my whole approach here.
That's a good thing. One source, the YouTube video that you mentioned, demonstrates a really clever technique for interior doors with privacy locks. They actually drill right through the handle, disabling the locking mechanism.
That's pretty ingenious. Simple yet effective.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that sometimes the less flashy methods are the most practical. Okay, let's up the ante. We're talking exterior doors now. Sturdier construction, maybe even metal.
Yeah.
What's the game plan in this scenario?
Yeah, exterior doors are a whole different beast. Brute force is much less likely to work here. You might need to bring some tools into play.
Tools.
Okay.
Now we're talking. What kind of tools are we thinking about here? Crowbars? Sledgehammers?
Well, hopefully, you won't need to go that extreme. But a pry bar is definitely high on the list in our sources. It's incredibly useful for forcing a door open, especially if you can get it wedged in near the latch or the deadbolt.
Yeah, I can see how a pry bar would give you some serious leverage. You'd be surprised what I can do with a good lever and a fulcrum.
Haha. Archimedes would be proud. But in all seriousness, a pry bar can be a lifesaver in an emergency situation. And a hammer can come in handy too, especially for removing hinge pins.
Right, you mentioned that technique earlier.
Yeah.
But that only works on certain types of doors, right? And I'm guessing it doesn't leave the door in very good shape?
You're absolutely right. Removing hinge pins is most effective on outward swinging doors with removable hinges, and it definitely causes some damage. For those more extreme cases, some sources even suggest a reciprocating saw or an angle grinder for cutting through a door.
Wow, an angle grinder. Now that's serious business. But I guess we are talking about extreme emergencies here.
Exactly. Those tools would only be used as a last resort, like if the door was completely blocked or jammed.
All this talk about tools and techniques, it's making me think about my own front door. I have a deadbolt, which I now realize is a good thing. But are there other ways to make a door more resistant to forced entry? Besides just hoping for the best?
That's a smart question. A few of our sources touch on exactly that. One of the most basic things you can do is ensure your door frame is strong and well secured to the wall.
Makes sense. You don't want the frame itself to be the weak point.
Right. A solid door frame is the foundation of a secure door. And of course, a good quality deadbolt is essential. But there are also things like reinforcing plates you can install around the lock and the strike plate.
Reinforcing plates. I've heard of those, but I'm not really sure what they are.
They're basically metal plates that add an extra layer of protection to the weak points of your door. There are different types, like wraparound plates that cover the entire door jamb, or strike plates that reinforce just the area around the latch. They make it much harder for an intruder to pry the door open.
So basically just make it as difficult as possible for someone to get leverage.
Exactly. Some people even install security bars or door chains for added protection. But even with all of that, it's important to remember that no door is 100% impenetrable. A determined intruder with the right tools and enough time could potentially break through anything.
That's a little unsettling to think about. I'm starting to feel a lot less secure right now.
It's understandable to feel that way. But remember, it all comes back to preparedness. If you have a good home security system and you're aware of your surroundings, you can deter most would-be intruders.
So the best defense is a good offense. Or, well, maybe not offense exactly, but you know what I mean.
I think proactive is the word you're looking for. Being proactive about your safety and security is always the best approach.
Proactive it is. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Different types of doors, techniques for breaking them down, tools we might need, and even tips for making our homes more secure. What stands out to you as the most surprising or interesting takeaway from all of this research? Anything that really made you go, huh, I didn't know that.
I think what fascinates me most is how the reality of breaking down a door differs from the way it's often portrayed in movies and TV shows.
Oh, absolutely. It's not the glamorous one kick in your in scenario they make it seem.
Exactly. It can be physically demanding, potentially dangerous, and there's always a risk of injury or property damage. It requires a good understanding of the mechanics involved, not just brute force.
You know, I have to admit, I did have a bit of an action hero fantasy going into this, but you've definitely cured me of that. Now I'm even more convinced that calling a professional is usually the smartest move.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that's a really valuable takeaway for anyone curious about this topic. It's important to have realistic expectations and understand the potential consequences. Sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is know your limits.
That's a great point. So what does all of this mean for you, our listener? We've learned the mechanics of breaking down a door, but maybe the real lesson is about being prepared in other ways, thinking about home security, having emergency plans in place, maybe even having a good locksmith's number on speed dial. It's about being proactive, like you said. Food for thought, right?
Absolutely food for thought. And speaking of food for thought, a couple of our sources brought up something that I thought was really interesting. It's that the psychological aspect of breaking down a door. They talked about how in a high stress situation, you know your adrenaline's pumping. You might feel this like surge of energy and determination.
Oh yeah, I could totally see that. Like you're in fight or flight mode, ready to smash through any obstacle.
Exactly. But the sources also point out the potential downside. You could actually be more prone to making mistakes, acting impulsively, you might not think as clearly, and underestimate the force needed, or the risks involved. It's almost like your brain is saying, go, 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 while your body's not quite caught up.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's not just about knowing the techniques. There's a mental aspect to it, too.
Yeah.
You have to be prepared for the whole experience, the stress, the adrenaline.
Precisely. And that's where training and practice come in. If you're serious about learning these techniques for emergencies, you shouldn't just read about them. You should actually practice in a safe, controlled environment, not, on your own front door like we were joking about earlier.
Definitely not. So there are ways to learn this skill responsibly if our listener is really committed.
Absolutely. There are places that offer professional training on forced entry, security training schools, even some martial arts studios. They can teach you the proper techniques and help you develop that mental preparedness.
Well, this has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive. We started out with this kind of Hollywood image of breaking down a door, but we've learned it's so much more complex. It's a skill that should only be used in true emergencies. And even then, it requires planning technique and maybe even a bit of mental fortitude.
I think that's a great way to put it. And perhaps the biggest takeaway is that being prepared for an emergency involves a lot more than just knowing how to break down a door.
Right. It's about having a plan, the right tools, and like you said, knowing when to call in the professionals. Sometimes knowing when to not break down the door is the smartest move. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, but as always, there's still more to explore. Next week, we'll be tackling something completely different, the surprisingly controversial history of the pineapple. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and maybe keep that locksmith's number handy, just in case.